So far, I've talked about why he embraces idealism. But what about the absolute part? What gets Schelling to absolute idealism? Here, the idea is to talk again about the missing explanation argument. After all, that's what drives Kant to think he can't be an idealist. He needs things in themselves. Why is it that my experiences relate to yours in the way they do? I clap my hands, you hear it. I say something, you hear that. I have this experience that things happen regularly. I hear more or less the same sound whenever I clap my hands. I look away from the computer, I look back, it's still there. And so, in general, there's it's not just a dream. It would be bizarre to say the world is just a mental construction as if it were a dream or a daydream or some kind of fantasy or something. No, it has a regular structure. And it's got a regular structure, not just in my mind, but in yours. Your construction and mine seem closely related in some way. How's that possible? The only answer can be that there is ultimately one consciousness, one mind, one thing that all our minds are predicates of. This might be something like the Tao in Taoism, Brahman in Hinduism. But however we think of this, maybe God, we're forced to postulate one thing that everything else is a mode of, a modulation of, a predicate of, in some way a manifestation of. He says, if that were not true, then we would really be in trouble. We would not be able to understand why your experiences correlate with mine, or why mine actually have a kind of regularity built into them. We would think it's just as if we were all sitting around daydreaming. No reason why your daydreams should correspond to mine. No reason why mine today should correlate in any way with mine tomorrow. And so if we just go with our individual minds as constructing reality, we can't explain why they construct them in similar ways across time and from person to person. But if we assume that we're all modifications of one thing, one mind, or at some points he suggests something like a neutral monism. Maybe this absolute is actually beyond the distinction between mind and body, and it's something else entirely. But whatever it is, well, we are manifestations of that one thing which has a dynamic of its own. And that's why our experiences correlate one to another, and why there are regularities in our experiences. That's what makes intersubjectivity possible. So Schelling says, the I think I am is, since Descartes, the basic mistake of all knowledge. Thinking is not my thinking, and being is not my being, for everything is only of God, or the totality. In short, the absolute. Well, Schelling had worked all of this out prior to Hegel writing the Phenomenology of Spirit. But once Hegel published that, Schelling, you might expect, jumped on board. No, he became highly critical of Hegel. He thought Hegel went about it in the wrong way. And his reason had to do with the contingency of the world. In Hegel, there is a sense that the laws that govern the progression of Geist, of spirit, across the various stages described in the phenomenology, those are necessary laws. And so it looks as if what we see in the phenomenology is something like a description of stages in the necessary development of spirit itself. But Schelling says, I look around at the world and I don't see a lot of necessity in it. I mean, I see some necessity, the necessity we describe in terms of physical laws. But he says there's a lot of contingency too. It seems like a remarkable contingency that any of us were ever actually born. And it's not just that. Why is the world the way it is? The world appears to be contingent, both as a whole and in its parts. He says it can't possibly be the impression of something which has arisen by the necessity of reason. In fact, he says it contains a preponderant mass of unreason. Now, it's not just unreason, it is also evil. Why is there evil in the world? If we've got reason working itself out rationally and necessarily through these necessary laws throughout history, then why isn't it just great? Why do we find evil in it? After all, you might think of starting with mathematical axioms and going on to prove theorems and corollaries and so on in a mathematical textbook. You don't encounter evil in the course of that. And so why is there evil in the world if it's something like the development in a mathematical textbook from the beginnings and then the development of the theory and so forth through the progression of necessary laws of reason? That doesn't produce evil, but there does seem to be a lot of evil in the world. So what do we say about that? Schelling says it's a serious problem, and it forces us to back away from Hegel's idea that the world is ultimately rational. Hegel concludes that what is real is rational and what is rational is real. Schelling says, unfortunately, that's not true. There's a lot of unreason, a lot of irrationality in the world. There's a lot of chance that seems to govern human affairs. And there are a lot of choices that we make that are acts of freedom. And Hegel can't really take that into account. In the end, there may be small-scale freedom, but it doesn't look like there's any large-scale human freedom available in the phenomenology of spirit. And so we see here an important step already from Hegel toward Nietzsche, who says famously what we now call the world is the result of a number of errors and fantasies. What for Nietzsche is error and fantasy is in Schelling just irrationality, unreason, things that don't make sense, that are utterly contingent and didn't have to be that way at all. Nevertheless, Schelling doesn't dissent from all aspects of Hegel's thinking. He does think of the absolute as self-disclosing throughout history. There is a development of the absolute and a self-disclosure, but it is not a necessary one. It's filled with contingency. We do have a story here of a unitary self that splits and then synthesizes to bring the world of appearance and the empirical self into existence. Ultimately, it achieves self-consciousness. That is the basic model that Hegel was to use in the phenomenology of spirit. So here we can see that Schelling lines up with Hegel against, for example, Fichte, who thinks that self-consciousness is simply built into the very nature of consciousness. Schelling says, no, Hegel is right that self-consciousness is an achievement. It's not just a given. It's not just part of consciousness of the world or consciousness as a human being of the world. It's something that requires a kind of splitting and synthesizing and self-overcoming of the self itself. And only then can we become fully self-conscious. But that isn't driven by necessary laws of reason. In fact, it's not entirely driven by reason at all. It is driven largely by unconscious forces, by things that are not transparent to us. In fact, may be ultimately unintelligible. Not only are they not right there on their face to be examined by us, maybe they can't even be examined. We can't even discover them. He thinks of the basic driving force of the model, not as rational, but as ultimately irrational or beyond rationality. It's unconscious. The basic forces lying behind the dynamics of the self and of our consciousness are not themselves accessible to consciousness. So we are ineluctably bound to be strangers to ourselves. Not only are we not in a state where we know ourselves, we can't be. Know thyself, Schelling says, I don't think it's even possible. The basic driving forces of the self are not available to us. They are hidden, they are unconscious, they can't even with effort be brought into consciousness. In this way, Schelling is an important foreshadowing of Freud, but in a certain sense, he goes beyond Freud. Freud thinks, yes, they're unconscious, but I've got a technique, psychoanalysis, that can reveal them through the nature of dreams and perhaps through other things. Schelling says, I don't think they can be revealed. I think they are the driving forces of the development of consciousness, and they are beyond our understanding. They are ultimately unintelligible. They are simply not accessible to consciousness. Far from man and his activity making the world comprehensible, Schelling writes, man himself is that which is most incomprehensible. Does that mean we can't understand ourselves at all? That we have no window into the unconscious mind? Schelling says, well, actually, no, we do have a window, but it's not a rational window. Neither is it something that can be achieved through psychoanalysis or some kind of special scientific or quasi-scientific technique. He says it's art. Art is the window on the unconscious mind. Art can represent what reason can't. The only window we have into the unconscious, into these forces that are driving the self, is art. Art can represent what reason cannot. What it represents, however, is rationally inaccessible to the artist. So it's not just that we look at a work of art, we say, I wonder what the artist had in mind. Even the artist doesn't understand the unconscious forces that are driving him or her to produce that work of art. And so the perspective of the artist has no particular privileged place. The artist's intentions, what the artist was thinking, it's all irrelevant to the essence of the work of art. because even the artist cannot understand the unconscious forces that are issuing in that work of art. Can anyone understand a work of art? Well, that work does give us a glimpse into the unconscious mind. But your glimpse is as good as mine, and they're both as good as the artist's. The artist is really allowing those unconscious forces out in the work of art, but they're rationally inaccessible, consciously inaccessible, even to the artist.